with nothing but a mighty telephone. I know that I'm the way on it's a shame. Well, baby, won't you please come home?
guys be cool? We're good. Oh yeah, you're ready. Thank you. We're going to start in just a moment here, so if you can grab a seat, grab a drink, order your food.
Don't stop talking.
Don't stop talking. Stop talking.
Yeah, hey, what happened to Freebird? Oh, right.
Let's give it up for Ralph Hamparian. John Yo. So we're getting set up here. I might as well say something. My name is David Friedlander, and along with Julian Boxenbaum here, I organize Lucid NYC, and for whom is this your first visit to Lucid NYC? Please show your hands. All right, we've got a number of virgins in the room and many soiled Lucidites here. So if you're not aware of what Lucid is, let me edify you. Basically, we're kind of a clearinghouse for the city's best and brightest thinkers and doers and people really who are very engaged with their worlds. And we find it's, I'm sure as you have, where it's a really self-selecting crowd, that you guys, by virtue of being interested in who's here tonight, are engaged with your world and find like minds. And really, we're one of the things that really excites us about this event is the type of people that we attract, and that means you. So, welcome. So, we're getting set up here. I think we're setting up the wrong presentation right now, so just give us 1 second here. All right, so our first presenters are James Spindler and Evan Schechterman, from Radical Media. And you've probably seen Radical Media's work many a time. One of the more recognizable pieces is Arcade Fire, the Wilderness Downtown. And they've done the mission, a program around Mission Juno, is that that mission, which tracks NASA's mission to Jupiter. And if you've seen any of the, and they've done the Dos Equis campaign, which many the Dos Equis man, which many people know. And in my opinion, they're just really at the vanguard of, they call it transmedia, but we're really just making digital media beautiful and really, just really artistic. And I'm a great admirer of their work. And without further ado, I want to hand it over to Evan and James.
Evan Schechterman, pale-faced, pear-shaped CTO of Radical Media. Party, rock and roll. Right. And
I'm James Spindler, I'm the Chief Creative Officer of Radical Media.
I'll take the tuba mic.
Yeah, you will. And we're going to share 2 projects that are connected by crowdsourcing, and we're going to share the power and potential of crowdsourcing.
Yeah.
Hold the mics closer.
You got it. Let's see what you have. I forget where we are. All right, cool. So this is the Johnny Cash project. This is, you know, all right. All right. The rock and roll crowd. So the interesting thing about radical media is the number of disciplines that are under one roof, and part of that is the representation of talent. It's really groundbreaking visionary director, this guy Chris Milk, who did Arcade Fire's Wilderness Downtown and came up with the idea for what we put together for the Johnny Cash project. He did Rome, amongst other standard music video projects. He had an interesting year. There's a true cross-pollination of disciplines. And so here we have a traditional music, typically a traditional music video director who's asked to come up with an interesting project to celebrate the life of Johnny Cash. If anyone remembers Johnny Cash's last traditional music video, it was moody, it was dark, it's hard to top. And so we were commissioned by Rick Rubin and the estate to come up with a project to really let fans almost kind of leave flowers at the grave, so to speak, for Johnny Cash. So the process was relatively straightforward in that Chris Milk put together a 3.5, 4-minute music video, found footage, stock footage, estate footage, black and white, textured footage, and we put together this video that the crowd will never see as pure video. The magic number was we took every 8th frame from this music video and created a flip book of 1,370 consecutive stills that would have made up the music video. And then we loaded them into a system built by our Radical Media dev and design team, headed by James and myself, to put together a true example, a complete example of crowdsourcing, right? So the Wikipedia definition of crowdsourcing, of course, is that you know, a collective group of people who don't know each other coming together to solve a singular problem. And in this case, it was an interpretation of this music video. Let's switch spots like a dance.
And microphones.
Look at that. So, do we have internet here?
Yeah, there's Wi-Fi.
It's a series of two.
You're on.
A big part of this project too was reinventing the music video. How do you take something that's running a passive one-way experience and turn it into a collaborative experience?
And that's a theme that permeates a lot of the digital work that we do, is the fact that, definitely preaching to the choir in a room like this, that we've really changed from a culture of mostly media consumers to everyone almost being a media producer. And so how do you create a project? We missing Flash? That old thing?
Free download.
There we go. So how do you create experiences that really keep people engaged and make them part of the experience? So let's let this sucker load up. So there's a Google Chrome spot that I think we'll even show that was made after the popularity of the site, which is, it's always great to have a TV commercial for your website. Too bad we're not selling anything. So here's the general idea. You came into the site and you went right to contribute. Now the algorithm that we use for which frames from the video we served out to people over time, that algorithm changed over time. Because when you first came to the site, there were almost no submissions. So I'm not going to do this much justice. I'm going to choose frame 278. And we load it into a drawing tool. You know, we're relatively platform agnostic as a company, but in this particular case, Flash, a vector-based tool, was the right tool for the right job, and you'll see places where we really prove that. And so I'm going to try to draw. So you can, the brushes that we put in here are actually from texture from the music video, and just for the sake of time, I'm going to... And so you can change brush size, right? And then like a good animation tool, you can toggle it on and off. I'm not going to do this much justice, but I don't want to hog up time. We have more interesting things to talk about. So you can do as many brush strokes or as few brush strokes as you see fit, and when you're all done, you submit it to the system. And we want to know a little bit about you, predominantly where you are in the world, and you can choose from a few different categories. It's abstract, it's pointillism, it's realistic, it's what. So then we put this all into a community management tool. Because the wonderful thing about crowdsourcing and user-generated content is that it usually has a fairly high phallus factor. Even though people love Johnny Cash, you still get the occasional rejected frame. So this goes into a community management tool we built. We qualify the frames. You know, the estate said no drug references, no satanic references, no sexual references, you know, keep it clean. and also keep it relative to the frame that you selected. And then a few times a day, depending on how many submissions we get that are approved, the servers go through and remake this many versions of the music video. I'm going to go to the highest rated frames. What you're about to see is probably from, I don't know, 2 to 4 hours ago, from 5 o'clock, I think we run a script, a cron script, and we recompile a version of the music video. The bandwidth here is, here we go, I'll stop it in a second.
There ain't no great
Technology is getting in the way.
That's bandwidth is getting in the way. I was going to start popping and locking, but I refrained from doing so. So if you look down below, these stalactites, they represent multiple submissions for a single place and time. And as you mouse over them, you get a thumbnail of where they are in the world. But the great thing about Flash for this particular job is, and I'm going to select this frame. Come on, bandwidth. Okay, so I'll go to the previous frame here. So we know what this person's name is. We know where they are in the world. They consider it abstract. We know that they're probably unemployed because they spend 45 minutes, 22 seconds, and only 150 brushstrokes. But here, it's not the most elaborate frame. We store all the brushstrokes as binary data. So we can actually redraw all the brushstrokes. And the thing about this that's great is we can load in much larger brushes and re-render this frame at HD, poster size, billboard size. We can wrap a bus in it if we needed to. There'd be no reason to do just that. And then you can go and, of course, share your frame through all the normal social means. And on top of that, let's see what else was there in the project. We made an embedded player. So if you had your frame and you wanted to put it in your blog, we allow people to redraw it right then and there.
We should also note that when you see the number of submissions, see how many submissions there are, when this launched, there was all these black holes in the video because we didn't have the submissions. It was very unclear whether the whole thing would actually work. And it's been kind of amazing. I think it's in over 180 countries.
180 countries and territories, even in Kazakhstan. Great success. And, you know, I gotta say, we did kind of underestimate the creativity of the crowd, and it was kind of proof that people can come together and actually create something from their own little dark corners of the globe. So this was one successful and tangible, entertaining example of crowdsourcing, which is our very loose tie-in to the more academic and very deep, so here's the Chrome spot. Even though it had nothing to do with Google, in fact, it uses Flash. But who's counting? We'll take free TV time any day.
I felt really sad when he died, and it'd be really nice to contribute something to his memory.
I know we only have 15 minutes, so you'll have to visit thejohnnycashproject.com. There you can see the documentary, you can see the crowdsourcing across streams.
So it seems that I'm going to talk about a completely different project, very different in tone, but what links this to Johnny Cash is that it's a very different use of crowdsourcing. Some of you may have heard of this project.
You have 8 minutes.
What's that?
You have 8 minutes.
I have 8 minutes. I'll talk really fast. This is actually a much longer presentation that I've reduced, but 1920-21 stands for 19 cities with a population of 20 million in the 21st century. It's the brainchild of someone named Richard Saul Wurman. Maybe some of you have heard of him. He coined the term information architect. He's also the founder of the TED conference. And in the 60s, while he was at Yale, he did a book called Cities, about cities, form, and scale. And he came to a really simple realization that no two cities collect data the same way. So some people say that mass urbanization is the defining trend of the 21st century, that by 2050, 2/3 of the world will live in a city. So at Radical, we were tasked with giving voice and vision to this initiative, which was really a 5-year academic study. And we were asked to kind of bring it to life in some really interesting ways.
You gotta do it at like cocaine speed.
Okay, okay. So understanding precedes action. Basically what it is we want to develop a tool that allows cities to be compared on an equal basis. So it's a partnership between Radical Media, Richard Saul Wurman, and Esri, which is the largest GIS company in the world. GIS stands for Geographic Information Software, and it's fast becoming an important way of looking at data. Super fast, super fast. Okay, so the whole notion of what is a city, where does it begin and end? Some people consider from Boston to Washington to be a single megalopolis. You can't measure a city unless you can define where its edge is. So this is an example of Tokyo. Tokyo can be as small as 8.6 million or as big as 42.6 million people. That's a widely divergent number. These are some images from MDA Federal that show concrete density. Some people use concrete density to measure the size of a city. So this is over the past 22 years, some quick images of how New York City has developed. And I'm doing this to make a point, which you'll see in the next slide, which is New York City can be measured by its political boundaries, by its transportation boundaries, by the MSA boundaries. Those are the 23 counties that if there was an emergency, the mayor would have to inform. Concrete density, which I showed you earlier, and some people measure a city by city lights. So that's a compilation that really shows you how widely divergent the definition of a city is. But how powerful would it be to come up with a single measure so that we could look at doctor-patient ratio, or average commute time, or air quality? And that's what 1920-21 endeavors to do. So we worked with a team of GIS and graphic designers. This is a map of New York that basically overlays population density and education levels. You can see that sharp line in the middle of Central Park. There's a big hill there. Sometimes topographical areas affect education levels. You can look at that pocket in the lower right, the lower east side.
Education does not roll uphill, according to this, this study. It's a really strange thing.
Apparently not. On the Lower East Side, you can see there's lower levels of education, and that's because of a large immigrant population. Not surprisingly, household income is really correlated very closely to education levels. This is a map that shows you major trucking routes in New York. Those are the major industrial areas. You can see JFK in the lower right, my right. And this overlays elemental air carbon, so it shows you that by those choke points, by the trucking routes, that air quality is not very good. And then if we overlay where people live, you kind of can come to the conclusion that there's a correlation between the two. So the idea is to do this kind of mapping worldwide. I'm only showing you New York because we're in New York, but if you could come up with equal apple-to-apple comparison, that would be a really powerful thing. So what do we do with all this data once we have it? How do we get people engaged with it? And that really became the task of Evan and I and our team. So this is a short trailer that we cut together that's the basis for hopefully a television series. And this is a project that we've been working on for 3 years. We're not there yet. We've identified some interesting partners, but this is all the data that we would collect from this universal means of comparison would be expressed in a really interesting, entertaining way.
You did it.
I hope. So
50
here it
minutes.
is.
Cities. They're home to more than half of the world's population. Within the next 40 years, it will be 2/3. 70 million people will move to a city each year. 1.4 million per week. 130 every minute. What is the gravitational pull of cities? And why is the attraction so universal? Why are they organized the way they are? What do cities tell us about us? Cities, a groundbreaking television series, will explore every aspect of city living in every corner of the world through a unique and innovative lens. The series will observe the fascinating ways in which we, as human beings, use our resources, our instincts, and our ingenuity to thrive within these massive organisms of our own creation. How do we move? How do we communicate? How do we manage our food and water supplies? How do we satisfy our energy needs? How do we consume and recycle? How do we learn? How do we trade and invest? How do we maintain the health of our children, our aging, and ourselves. With human migration to cities happening on such an unprecedented scale, how will all these things change? Cities will be a comprehensive and voyeuristic survey of our world's largest concentrations of population, how they work, how they evolve, and how their future will define our future. Cities, understanding the way we live.
So it's kind of epic. Cities is the consumer facing of the initiative. 1920-21 is the academic data collection part of it. And the point of this was to ask all these questions that the initiative would hopefully answer. So the connection with crowdsourcing is none of this would work if governments did upload data to a universal template. So without global cooperation, it will never work. And there's lots of privacy issues that go with that, but we're really excited about the potential and promise of it, and it's just been a really unusual project to work on. So hopefully some of this made sense, and thank you so much.
I was going to bring my name to the land.
Well, we have one. You're lucky. So this is the fun part where you get to ask questions of our speakers. So does anyone have any questions? Come on, don't be shy. There's one.
How did you gather all the footage for
How did you gather all the footage? We just have to...
Right now, it's all stock footage. Sadly. It's all just a keynote. We kind of refer to it as Planet Earth for People. So we had a very clear vision of what we wanted it to look like, but...
Or city porn.
Yeah. There's actually a couple of series on cities that are pretty interesting. There's one called Human Planet. I don't know if anyone saw it. It was by the same producers as Planet Earth. It's a very different focus, but one of the interesting fun facts that I learned that you might find interesting is Abu Dhabi has no pigeons, and the reason why is because they hired a Feligan Palcrin handler that is basically hired to eliminate all pigeons from the city. One of many interesting facts. But one of the things I wanted to say about cities that I didn't mention is while I showed you a television expression of it, the idea is to come up with a digital portal for everything urban so that we could really do comparisons. And I didn't want to go too far over my time with it, but these are some slides of what that website would look like. So it would be a pretty remarkable thing to be able to go to a single destination and be able to compare what the average commute time is, air quality, some of the other issues that I mentioned.
There's a question.
I haven't seen it yet, but Gary Custer is just coming out and organized. What's the relationship?
Well, there is no relationship. I did see it. What's the relationship between Gary Houston's film Urbanized? Gary Houston's... What are we planning to do together? I think they're totally different, but there's obviously a keen interest in urban development and what's happening. I think he interviewed architects and urban planners all over the world and just basically took a kind of objective look at what makes different cities tick. This is really based on data. We like to say that data is the story. So what we want to do is we want to come up with a template that allows local governments to upload data, but that it can be evaluated equally. Right now, there's the U.S. Census, there's the Japanese Census, but they're collected in very different ways. So what Gary's done is do a very creative documentary that kind of gives you a look at what some of the most pressing issues in various cities are. What we're doing is coming up with a utility that allows people to compare that data, and then we as a media company take that data and find interesting expressions of it. So it could be apps, it could be a website, it could be a television series. Does that answer your question a little bit? He's done kind of a slice in time, and we're doing something that has a much longer lifespan, we hope.
Good. One more question?
Right here.
There we go.
So how do you incentivize governments to look at data?
I think the power of being able to understand the world is a pretty good. How are we incentivizing governments to upload data is the question. And I think the promise of like true understanding is a really good incentive. There's lots of privacy issues. It's relatively complex. But we live in an increasingly global world with trade and everything else. It was interesting when we presented this presentation, we got some interest from a very big courier company, and it was fascinating to hear the data they capture of what's being shipped where and in what volume. So I think there's lots of examples about how people can start. We want people to start. People already are looking at the world in a much more collapsed form, and this is a tool that hopefully helps consolidate that thinking. So the incentive is just greater understanding. That's why it starts off, understanding precedes action. We don't prescribe what the solutions are. We just want to provide a utility that will hopefully inspire better thinking.
You know, the other way that we came around to not incentivize governments to collect data is the partnership with Esri. When they started to see people that are non-GIS people, you know, the media people, visualizing it and doing comparison in a really fresh way, we started to influence the way that their clients are governments and countries. So we've started to accidentally influence the way that Esri builds their comparison tools. So they have this big, huge conference, which is boring, every year.
It wasn't that boring.
No, I'm joking. It's like we make it look sexy, and they do the real science behind it. And they started to show at this conference new comparison tools based on some of the visualizations that James and his team did. So when they go to collect the data, now they just display it in different ways, and it influences them, which is really an interesting effect.
Exactly, and there's never been more data, and it's so global, so it just seems kind of myopic to look at things in a very siloed way. So that's kind of the intention of it.
Well, thank you very much. That was terrific.
Thank you so much for having us.
So, if you haven't been here before, if you're not familiar with Lucid, our speakers will stick around so that you can speak with them after the event. There's a whole social agenda or social event after the speakers, after the presentation, and that's really the objective here, is to get you all to speak with them and to speak with each other, and this is just the primer. So our next presenter, actually presenters, we are fortunate, we're doubly blessed to have them, is a husband and wife team that it's very hard to pigeonhole. They are extremely creative. They work in many fields, in advertising and branding and arts. They founded the Wooster Collective, which basically brought street art to the fore and basically gave it a platform to become recognized as real art, which is now currently recognized as. They're also heavily involved with I-Beam, and I think Mark is the chair of I-Beam, which is the best way. It's a New York-based think tank for the convergence of art and technology, and they are both partners in Bond Strategy and Influence, which deals with branding and marketing in new ways. And tonight's presentation is titled Art versus Advertising, the War for Public Space. So without further ado, Mark and Sara Schiller. Bring these closer together.
When we started this pursuit, this passion, I guess around 2000, it seemed like for us anyway, it was very easy to kind of separate street art and the desire to reclaim public space from advertising, and it was very clear. You kind of knew what was which. And then like any movement, things start to get a little bit messy and the gray areas start to emerge. And I think what Sara and I have always been passionate about, living in Lower Manhattan, downtown, and really wanting an environment that was creative for us and creative for our daughter and others, was a place where we were inspired every day. And seeing thousands and thousands of photographs from all over the world every day, literally every day, and sharing a portion of that online, what happened was we started seeing these narratives play out where advertising was co-opting street art, street artists were co-opting advertising, and we started to get really interested in kind of how this evolution started. And so today we pulled some stories and some slides to kind of delve into that.
Yeah, we're also fascinated with branding, and what we've seen evolve over time is that the brands who are effectively using mass media or outdoor advertising to grow their brand are oftentimes co-opting the street artists' sensibility or mechanisms, but the street artists themselves are going out And they're becoming brands, whether they intended to or not, by using mass media. So it's this interesting circle that, that continues to evolve and the dialogue continues to go.
So Roadsworth was an artist who we really gravitated to his story. He in Montreal and throughout Canada would do these massive pieces. This is one example of just so many pieces that he did. And he literally in the middle of the night would go out with a roller and take signage and public safety, organizational structures and tweak them to make the city, when it woke up in the morning, much more fun and much more playful. But what happened with him was not only was he arrested for this and charged with 52 counts, but he actually was really put under a real strong microscope, because the issue was this public safety component, because of the fact that when we walk across the street, those, that grid is really supposed to essentially try to keep us safe. Whether that's true or not, that's the issue. So when he was arrested, the fine and the severity was very, very strong. And what was interesting is that the city, through radio, DJs, and others, really rallied around him and really took him in and saved him from a very serious jail time. And so what happens is that you start with kind of this freedom of creativity, and then over time what happens is through the internet, with creative directors or people sharing stuff, it starts to get really diluted, and you end up with something like this, which is really amazing when you think about it, because the scale of this piece, it's still supposedly in public safety, but because McDonald's had the ability to write a check, McDonald's can do this, but an artist can't. And that's when it starts to, for us, get really, really kind of compact.
And what's really fascinating, and what we may partially be responsible for, is that people are so used to going online to look at images that this McDonald's image probably only was done in one city in one place, but because of the nature of the internet, it was seen by thousands or tens of thousands of people around the world. So the viral nature of what the street artist is using or ends up happens with the branding work also.
And often the client doesn't know that Roadsworth ever existed, thought that whatever agency did this, it was their brilliant idea. So they never knew the authenticity, and they assume that suddenly something like this is going to be accepted. And then you start to question, well, is it actually real? Was it Photoshopped? Do we have to look deeply into it? And it starts to get very, very confusing. This was something that we got very involved in with, which actually was the first time where this colliding of brands and street art hit us in the face. It was ironic because at the same time that this happened, one of my largest clients was Sony. And what happened to Sarah and I was a really interesting story. We got this photograph sent to us from somebody, and we were trying to share as much street art as possible. This was very early on, and we just wanted to show people that street art was everywhere, that this was not confined to a few cities, that it was there. And we put this piece up very, very quickly, and within 2 seconds we got an email, and it was, do you realize what you guys put up? That's an ad for Sony. And we looked at it and we're like,
Sony PlayStation, the PS.
And then we looked closer, and then obviously it made sense that they were playing with a PS2, which was just coming out at the time. And it led to us getting emails of the same piece in a different city put up the same weekend. And that led to us seeing it in our own neighborhood in all these different articulations. And it was suddenly very clear that Sony was going in and having people put the ad in places where ads don't normally go, meaning around the alley, but where street art goes. So the placement of the ad was to give it more credibility and more legitimacy. So we went online and we immediately brought this to attention. And then what started to happen?
The backlash.
The backlash started. And then you start to see, this, and this, and this. And
it's pretty harsh.
It became very harsh. But then it gets very interesting because you think, okay, well, this is kind of black and white. And that leads us to an artist in Toronto.
So this is a work by Dan Bergeron, who again does wheat paste, and oftentimes these are his friends or his neighbors or people in his community that he's making life-size images of, and he's going out and putting them up on the street. So this is his style for people who live in Toronto and people who follow him on the internet. Everyone knows that this is his work.
So one day we got sent the following photograph. And it was this. And now we're much more savvy. You know, we look at things and we see brands, and I look at this and I'm like, something's not right here. That is definitely an ad for Vespa, because an artist just wouldn't do that. And we knew that it was Dan, and we went back to Dan, and Dan said, will you please put it up? Please do that. We did, because what Dan wanted to push forward was that dialogue that, as an artist, because they actually hired Dan to do the Vespa wheat paste.
To take his own characters and to play with them and to make them into part of the brand message. And I think this is when Mark and I really started to understand that it was not all black and white, and that there are people like Dan who are out there trying to live as artists, and it's so difficult that at times they need or want or choose to do things like this, and that he was willing to do it and got paid the fee that he wanted to get paid to take his own work and make it into a branding message.
And then you get into the complexities of somebody like Shepard Fairey. And, you know, with Shepard, it started with, when he was at RISD, you know, the Andre the Giant, and that original sticker, which before the internet, before we had the ability to communicate, Shepard was able to get that sticker in cities all over the world on back of signage before anybody really had the type of connectivity that we have. And with Shepard, it's very interesting to see the life of what's happened with specifically the Andre the Giant image that he created as a student. It started as this. It then led to other variations, which you can start to see the roughness of it, the design, the order of it starts to come through, because he's playing with Russian iconography now and all
design.
Graphic design and all the things. You start to see the advertising motifs start to come in through wheat paste and through things that you would expect with advertisements, but it's still keeping its non-commercial quality to it.
But he has more size and repetition.
And then you start to see people co-opt because of the power of that original image. So you start to see on the street all of these variations of what Shepard had put out there because of the power of that original image.
So it doesn't stop with George Bush. It goes on to Obama, Mark Zuckerberg, and it continues.
To literally, and Shepard puts these on his website, so if you go to the OBEY website, you'll actually see that they're all on there, and it becomes very fascinating.
And fun.
And then that leads, though, to some real controversial things. This is a wall that was originally painted by Keith Haring. It's on Houston Street, not too far from here. And when Shepard did his show at Deitch, which was the final show at Deitch Gallery, that same week, Shepard did this massive wall, which is very conflicting, because in some ways it's not really selling anything. But if you look at it, well, is it selling Shepard Fairey? Is it selling Shepard Fairey's gallery show? Should that matter? Should it not matter? And suddenly, because of the iconography of what Shepard has done and the clear evidence that this is Shepard and nobody else, you start to lose touch with what is art and what is advertising. And we're very close friends with Shepard, so for us it's not a judgment. We see both sides and we try to balance both sides, but it becomes very, very complicated in some ways.
Well, and there's another layer that this exact piece was for sale inside the show for tens of thousands of dollars. So you could go and buy it, or you could see it for yourself for free on the street.
And then you see pieces like this that Shepard does, and now you start to say, well, it's clearly Shepard, but is it beautifying the neighborhood, or is it advertising? Really, what is it doing? And I think that dialogue is what Sarah and I are really fascinated by, because I don't know, I mean, you'll have very strong opinions on both sides, but is there really an answer? Is there an answer that should be justified? And I think that question is really what interests us.
And then the obviously people know that his clothing line has expanded using the same imagery and iconography into mainstream urban outfitter type locations. We've actually met people and said, oh, you must love street art, you're wearing a Shepard Fairey shirt, and they didn't even know that it was him. It was a t-shirt that they thought that was really cool, urban outfitter.
And then it leads to, ultimately, a full reverse cycle of a commentary on the whole thing. Then you have artists like JR, which is he's one of the purest artists that we've met. Wins the TED Prize, but really convinces them that there's not going to be a banner ad on anything that he does. He's really very purist, and we know him very well, and he is definitely not interested in any of the blurring the lines, and he really is very motivated. But even somebody like him loses complete control, because this was a situation that Sarah pointed out one day when she was watching TV.
Yeah, so we'll scroll through. We just have a couple images of his work just to remind everyone, or if you haven't seen it, he does life or gigantic size portraits of people that he goes out and puts up on the streets.
So this image, 90% of the people that see this image, this is the Tate Modern, which was very large. It didn't last very long because he works with very thin paper, but 90% of the people see it as a gun because of the prejudiceness of the image, and very few people see that that's a camera in the first look. And so JR is really working from a very specific point of view. Can you have pieces like this?
So wait.
Yeah,
okay. So this is the piece where I was watching TV one day, and a Volkswagen ad comes on, and the ad's playing, and I was paying somewhat attention, and I'm like, that's a JR piece. Went and dug up the video of the ad online, and when we paused on that, we started to realize
something's off.
Something was wrong.
That's not. He works with a very specific millimeter, 28 millimeters. Something's not right. That can't be his piece.
And we knew that he would really never work with Volkswagen. So we were able to find the image. If you go back one more, Mark. This is JR's piece, and you can see the gas station or the parking lot. There's signs of the name of the parking lot on the building in front. What they've done is they actually digitally erased all of the other brands that were on the building, and digitally erased JR's piece and put in a piece that matched their ad campaign, which was a bunch of people high-fiving and waving at each other. So it looked like a piece of street art, but it was actually completely in line with their brand.
And then what really gets interesting for us is when the two start to really collide. So this is Princess Hijab in Europe, in Paris, and this is a very specific action in the subways. And Sarah, I think you've been communicating with them.
Yeah, he goes in, he chooses the biggest, largest subway stations in Paris because he wants to use the same media that the big brands are using. He wants the same number of impressions and people to see it, but he wants to take it back and get a message across, in particular around the French or the political dialogue that was happening around wearing the headscarf. And he also says that he's taking these images of like these perfect bodies and completely taking away the power that they have by putting the headscarf on. So we only have 1 minute. And with that, should we just do this one last one?
Yeah, this is actually a project that we kind of actually really like, because like we're not really, I think we see both sides, and because we are involved in brands. This was a project that Adidas did with Adicolor in Berlin, and it started with these very plain canvases that were put up, these billboards, but they did have an Adidas ad.
Logo on
so it wasn't as if it was just white. On the top you could see an Adidas logo, and then there was some text. And like any piece of blank canvas on the street, over time it gets tagged, it gets mucked up, it gets written on top of. So these are just photographs of what happened. And then what happened was, to show what the added color line was really all about, was that they went back and they covered the graffiti that was put there with the shoe showing the colors through the shoe.
So we think this is fun, and it's a way that the brands can use the street in a clever way, and it's on target for them. So I think we actually should stop. You want to do that?
No, we can
All right.
go on forever. So
Unfortunately,
We have a lot more
Yeah.
examples, but I think we'll stop there with Dan Witz's piece.
yeah, for Halloween it comes this. And then
Oh,
you get
wait,
the confusion
actually,
of Banksy.
We
which is
should
kind of-
end with
I don't
this
want to
one.
be the bad guy.
Yeah.
Like,
We'll
keep
just
going.
end with this one last piece, because this is sort of the full circle. When Banksy came to New York City to open his show that was around his pet shop, he is now so big and so famous, having used the street to, in a sense, build his brand. He's anonymous, so he can't actually go out now and put up his own work because he'd be identified. He's paying Colossal to go out and paint his imagery to promote his own show in an anonymous manner. So it's a brand having to pay the it's an artist having to pay the advertisers to put up their art.
Advertising, yeah.
So that's the full circle.
So once again, we have a fantastic presentation that we have to, cut because of time. But again, they're going to stick around after. Thank you for clarifying how to pronounce Adidas. Is that right? Because I've always wondered if it's Adidas or. And also, it's a really fascinating dilemma that I think a lot of professions are dealing with. You have writers, musicians. If you look back in history, I think a lot of creative people are struggling with the same kind of conundrum that visual artists are dealing with right now. So, very, very challenging. Questions?
Would you say that the street artists, in a way, are more like continuing exploring the issues of pop art that were first pioneered in the 60s with the consumerism, and then it eventually reflects back with advertising themselves or being co-opted, as opposed to the subway graffiti artists of the 70s, like Say Hi, people like that. Would you say it's more of a pop art thing that happens to be down the street?
So a couple things that we've learned over the years, and because access is literally you going out and doing something, and the only issue is whether you're willing to risk being arrested, you can go out and do whatever you want. So there isn't any one theme that you could say, well, street artists have this one motivation, except the ones that we've found have kind of been layered throughout, whether it's intentional or not. There's absolutely the need the passion to reclaim public space, to take back some of that space that has been sold to advertisers at a scale that is just overwhelming in our cities and our neighborhoods. So the one thing about this idea of reclaiming public space is pretty universal. They're not complete. And the other one is for most of the artists, it's really about beautifying neglected and energizing and reactivating dormant space. So you will see a lot of the most beautiful work in abandoned buildings, and it re-energizes that space that's neglected. And those have been kind of the two key themes that we've seen throughout most of the artists that we've met over the years.
There's a question.
Ask real quickly about photoreal's work. How did Vespa respond to that campaign? In particular, how do large advertising companies respond to these kind of small interventions that artists do in terms of their kind of bottom line?
I think they're caught by surprise. I don't think Sony had any idea what was going to happen when we were the first to expose this and to make it an issue and to be unrelenting. I think they felt that it was going to be something that they would do, get out of, and it would just be another campaign. I think the challenge is, with a lot of agencies, the authenticity gets left somewhere in the mix. So the client never really knows where the genesis came from. And I think they do get this boomerang often, and they're like, we had no idea. I mean, I've had it happen with work
Do you
that
think companies are working towards a PlayStation PSP campaign? Like, in particular, Vespa. Do you think that Vespa was hoping for a campaign that was on the level of the PSP?
Sure.
Like outcome, the kind of backlash that associated with it?
You mean, do they want the backlash?
Do they want that sort of backlash? Is that what they're going for when they're paying an artist $10,000 for a campaign that's possibly a multi-million-dollar campaign?
Yeah, it might be, Jordan. I mean, that we don't have insight into what Vespa was thinking. It could be. It's really hard.
That's the all PR is good PR. No shit.
I have a question. How do the companies and the corporations now differ from the nobility and the church, you know, in history? I mean, you're talking about going back and getting back to the freedom of artists, but hasn't there always been a patron in the arts?
But it's
what would be the optimum solution for you?
Well, yes. I mean, in theory, the brands have the money. And in theory, the artists need the money to realize large projects. And in theory, that should be a marriage that should work. The problem is that when you actually have to finalize that work, it's very, very rare that the purity of the intention of the piece makes it to what is the final piece. And at the end of the day, whether the logo is there or not, the brand is there to sell their product. And there is a motivation to make sure that as a patron, their message follows through on that. But at the same time, they do realize a lot of projects that would never happen if they weren't funded. Now on the flip side, the brands are very close to the artist because the artist is then getting a vehicle to become their own brand, and it starts to get very complicated.
And just to add one thing, many of the artists are trying to go around that by selling fine art and coming up with their version of fine art in order to fund their street projects. And that in itself has its own branding cycle.
Yeah, great. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time for the question and answer, but again, they'll be sticking around and you can speak to them directly. So thank you very much, Mark and Sara Schiller. So, Pete, why don't you gather the troops and come on up? So, we're going to try something now. Actually, this is a good time if you want to get drinks or something to eat. It's a good time to do it. But we're going to try something now that we haven't done before. We have a panel discussion. How many of you are would you say, are very familiar with Occupy Wall Street and what's happening? Okay. How many of you would say that you've heard of it and that you read about it like the headlines in the paper? How many of you have never heard about Occupy Wall Street? And don't be shy. Okay. So this is a good opportunity to learn a little bit more about it because we've assembled a panel of speakers who are heavily involved. They're key activists in this movement. And if you don't know about it, you really should, because it's an exercise in democracy, it's an exercise in individualism, and it's something that is essential to all of us sitting here in all of our rights, and whether you agree with them or not. And we, as Lucid, are not here to advocate for one side or another, but rather just to give a platform for the individuals who are participating to speak to you directly without the filter of media in front of them. So we have found an ambassador among our Lucid community in Pete Gallo, who has been participating, and he has graciously been researching for us what this is about, and he's managed to gather some really key speakers. So, Pete, are you ready?
Absolutely.
Here you go.
How's it going, everybody? So, it would seem like not everyone has been following since day one, so what I'm going to do here is basically put together a quick chronology and what is about the occupation. Let's see, so There's lots I could talk about, everything from hipster cop, who I'm sure you've heard of, to the censorship on Twitter, but I'm really going to focus on an objective view of the timeline, and then specifically New York. Unless I mention otherwise, I'm just talking about the occupation here in Zuccotti Park at Wall Street. I'm going to start with a little quote. It is, capitalist, if you think that you can play footsies with these people, you're wrong. They will come for you and drag you into the streets and kill you. It's Glenn Beck, a visionary journalist. And I would like to respond to that with, oh yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man. So, there's a lot that's been said about the occupation as a bunch of unemployed folks who have no clear focus, luckily for us. There have been a couple polls that went around that really kind of break up who this is. So in a poll of 200 protesters, 52% have participated in movements before, 98% support civil disobedience, 31% support violence, 15% are unemployed, and 65% say that the government should guarantee health care, college, and secure retirement. In the same poll, 30% are against the influence of corporations and special interest over policy. This is where I fall in. 11% are for changing the two-party system. That might not be too bad an idea. 6% are upset about income equality. 3% are opposing democracy and capitalism, and then 4% are for radical redistribution of wealth. So for all the talk that's been going on, it's like, oh, these are communists, these are anarchists, they want to just completely destroy our country. Only 3% are saying that they want to change democracy and capitalism. So I'm not sure if you know about how it really works. The occupation is made up of about 40 different working groups that each have their own specific purpose. All the decisions made at the occupation and in each working group are done by direct democracy through a process called the General Assembly. In the General Assembly, one person stands in the middle of a group of about 100 to 1,000 people and speaks their mind, and then the people around them echo what they've said so that everyone can hear. There's no amplification allowed at the protest. No mics, no bullhorns, nothing. So then from that point, if someone has asked a question or posed a new idea for the occupation, people will show by hand symbols whether or not they agree or disagree. This is I see Ethan in the front here knows, this is how you say that you agree with what's been said. Let's see here. All right. Oh yeah, also anyone who wants to speak may speak. They just have to do what's called get on stack, which means basically waiting in line to be a speaker. All right, so what's in Zuccotti? Here's a map of the community that's been put together down at Liberty Square. There are a couple information desks for passersby, a library, a media center, and a press desk. There's a kitchen that serves food practically all day long, and there's a medical tent that takes care of any sick or injured protesters. At any given moment, the park is surrounded by police, news vans, and food vendors. So now let's just get into the chronology, and we'll go through this really quick so we can get to what really matters to the panel of people who have been occupying day in and day out for the past 40 days. By the way, this is the 40th day of the occupation is today. So, yeah, it's pretty amazing, right? All right, so July 13th, Adbusters, which is a Canadian anti-consumerist magazine, announced that they would like to have a peaceful occupation of Wall Street. And then on August 2nd, the meetings started happening for planning the occupation, actually right here in Tompkins Square Park, which is not even a block away. On August 23rd, Anonymous, which is a hacktivist group with over 9,000 members in the U.S. alone, endorsed the movement. This was huge for Occupy Wall Street. Actually, 3 of our panelists here are representatives of Anonymous. Day 1 was September 17th, and 1,000 people attended, and 100 spent the night, about 100. Tents were torn down by the NYPD, no tents allowed, and amplification devices were forbidden. As I go through the next few dates, you're going to notice that all these key moments happened just days apart from one another, which really added to the momentum of the movement. Okay, so one of the first things that happened was on day 2, a bunch of people marched beneath the balcony of Cipriani's, which is, I don't know if you're familiar, is a rather fancy restaurant down right on Wall Street. Here's what happened. This hit the internet, and as you can imagine, people started to think, maybe there's something to this. I mean, if you ask me, this looks like something out of the French Revolution. So then, just days later, the state of Georgia decided to murder Troy Davis, and that caused the occupation to fuse with a march of over 2,000 protesters who all wound up down on the financial district storming the barricades at Wall Street. It was right around this time that New York Times, Guardian started to cover OWS, which is Occupy Wall Street, and at the same time, Michael Moore and Russell Simmons and other celebrities started to really jump on the cause. Then, just a couple days later, 2 days later, a cop pepper sprayed 4 women who had been detained already. Has anyone seen this video? It's kind of disturbing. I'm just going to warn you. I'm going to play it now. It's just a clip. Watch the right side of the screen. It's pepper spray. Doesn't look like too much fun. So, man, I can barely handle it. So, that released to the internet, everyone went crazy, and Anonymous actually tracked down and released the information of this officer who did the pepper spraying. I don't know if you can see it here. His name is actually Tony Baloney. I'm not even kidding, I wish that was a joke. And they released all of his contact information, so if you'd like, you can give him a call yourself at 518-989-9051, or visit him at 5 Sawyer Ave in Staten Island. So then, it's just a couple days later, again, we gained some support from unions and decided, hey, let's march over the Brooklyn Bridge. 5,000 people march over the Brooklyn Bridge and 700 are arrested. This is the first action that really enraged the entire nation. Then Wednesday, just a couple days after that, 15,000 protesters tried to breach the barricades at Wall Street, but were again held back by pepper spray and these giant orange nets that they've been holding. Day after that, Obama made a weak endorsement of the occupation, saying that it sounds like the people are angry, but it's really Republicans' fault. Great. Then that Saturday, SNL decided to cover Occupy Wall Street, which I think actually did a great favor for us. So, the following week, Bloomberg tells the occupiers that they gotta leave, they gotta evacuate so that we can power wash the park. Right. So the protesters responded with what was called the Sanitation Committee and started to scrub the park down. Meanwhile, Russell Simmons was actually offering to pay for park cleanup in order to avoid a confrontation. By 7 o'clock the next morning, the park was spotless, and this kind of cleanup actually happens every night now. Every night, the park is swept and mopped. All right, cut to the following Saturday. It was the day of global protests. There were protests in 1,500 cities across the nation. In New York, protesters marched from Zuccotti or Liberty Square all the way up to Times Square and then back down to Washington Square. In Madrid, 500,000 people turned out, so they take this a little bit more seriously than we do. And in Rome, 300,000, but they were not quite as peaceful. They burned plenty of cars, smashed windows at banks, etc., etc. Right around this time, also Willie Nelson and Pete Seeger joined in a march on Columbus Circle. So then, back in New York, this is just this past Saturday now, we're getting pretty current. There was a march against stop and frisk and a march against police brutality. Meanwhile, at Liberty Square, there were 1,200 cops and 16 prison buses that wound up doing nothing, but were seemingly there just to really intimidate the protesters. Things have been relatively peaceful until recently. There have been some internal struggles at the park, thefts and various crimes being perpetrated from the outside in on people who are occupying. But while the East Coast was kind of simmering down, Oakland got totally fucked up. I don't know if you guys heard about this, but 5 a.m. just a couple days ago, actually yesterday, they, yeah, right? They tear gassed everyone. They wound up actually shooting rubber bullets at people, flashbangs, and using LRADs, which are sound cannons. And then, so they dispersed about, 500 people, and 100 were arrested. And then that same night, hundreds, if not thousands, there are conflicting reports. The highest one I heard was 5,000 protesters took to the streets of Oakland and were met with the exact same response. This is a elderly lady in a wheelchair getting tear gassed, and she's being helped by 2 dangerous protesters. And then this is Scott Olson, who's a 24-year-old Marine veteran, served 2 tours in Iraq, got shot in the face with a rubber bullet, and is actually in critical condition right now. So I'm going to end with that. That's my name, that's my Twitter handle, and I think we're going to move on to our panelists now. All right. So first I'd like you guys to kind of just take a minute or 2 each to tell me about yourselves. Why are you occupying? What do you hope to achieve through occupation? And what's the most amazing or poignant or even horrifying thing you've seen since you've been there? Do you want to start, Justin?
Yeah. I was actually hoping he'd start.
Okay.
Okay, my name is Fetzer Mills. I'll stand up just because it's easier for me to stand up. I'm about to fall asleep. I'm operating on very few hours of sleep for the past week, so if I'm not particularly lucid, please forgive me. I came up here 2 weeks ago yesterday. I'd been watching this since the beginning. I guess I caught the Adbusters call to Occupy Wall Street and was curious if it was going to happen. And so on September 17th, I started watching, and I was going in and checking in on the internet every day, and I was watching it grow, and it was interesting to me, but I had given no thought at all to coming up to New York for it. And then I saw the Tony Baloney pepper spray incident one day, and that really got me mad. I'm a Navy veteran, and anyway, I just don't like seeing people in uniform abuse their power. But, you know, being there, you know, every unit's got a few bad apples in it, and I said, this is maybe a one-time thing, you know, and the guy's just a screw-up. And so then 2 days later, the Brooklyn Bridge March went down, and that was a military tactic they used against them. They used the white shirts to lead the marchers on the bridge, and they had nets waiting for them. Basically, they led them up the blind alley where they're waiting for them, and they're able to trap them. They had them in a pen. It was actually more like a livestock tactic, a Judas goat. They used the white shirts as Judas goats to lead them on the bridge, and then Connor, that was, I think, I felt like an attempt to intimidate a large number of people. They said, we're going to arrest 700 people. This is going to end it. You know, we show them we mean business. Had the exact opposite effect. I've run into so many people, particularly veterans who saw that, who said, I saw the Brooklyn Bridge March, that's why I'm here. The Tony Baloney thing brought more people in. Then 2 days after the Brooklyn Bridge March, Herman came. My wife is an attorney in Lauderdale County, Tennessee. And Lauderdale County is one of the poorest counties in the whole country. And so most of her clients are losing their houses. They're just in terrible shape. No jobs, no health insurance. And then she saw Herman Cain come on television and say, anybody in this country that doesn't have a job just doesn't want to work. And she got mad and she said, Fetzer, get your ass off that computer and get on the next plane to New York. So I'm here.
I'm Dwayne. I live in Brooklyn. I came out, I'm a videographer. I came out originally to shoot a documentary on the movement, and I decided that it was too difficult to stand back and just play with my camera while everybody's partaking in this movement. So I joined the media team. I work on the media team now with the live stream. We basically have a 24/7 media resource for anybody who wants to know exactly what's happening at Occupy Wall Street without the spin from the mainstream media. So that's what we're doing, and I'm here to help the movement.
I'm Jay. I'm a day one occupier. I had heard about it months before it had started. I'd been involved in some of the Adbusters campaigns. So I've been there since day one. I've been part of the planning of it. I guess I'm there because as a college student with massive debt, as a member of a working class family, I see the daily struggles that the working class goes through. So I feel like I'm obligated to be there, if anything, because this is our fight. As far as the most heinous thing I've seen, I mean, the Tony Baloney incident happened like 20 feet away from me. Like I was in that group when it happened. So I still remember that. Like it burns an image in your head. When you see people you see every day get pepper sprayed by a cop for no reason, it's kind of like, you know, it sticks with you. And I guess that's pretty much it for me.
I am Joe. I've been here since day one. I'm out here because I want accountability. We can't do anything with the current system that we've got now. And I've
met so many people here. I met Dylan Radigan, who wanted to start a campaign to get the money out of politics, and it sounded crazy, but it's something that if we want to get anything else done, I feel like we've got to do. I'm willing to do that as long as it has to be. We're going to all be here as long as we have to be. The best thing, I think, most memorable thing so far, I got a text message from Jesse LaGreca the night that they were going to evict. Jesse LaGreca is the one on YouTube, ripping Fox News to shreds all the time, Union Hat blogger, Ministry of Truth. Anyway, he's pretty well known. He texts me, he's like, I'm going into secret counter troll ops mode. I just found out Bloomberg is having dinner at Cipriani's. We just reserved the table next to him. 2 hours later, I look on Daily Kos, there's 2,000 people outside of Cipriani's, and I'm like, oh, crap. And then I woke up the next morning and we didn't get evicted. So, yeah, people power, man. People power.
I'm Troy. I come from an extremely old-fashioned, very old-fashioned family. Born and raised in Queens, New York, and pretty much I've just been taught to stay within the guidelines of the system that we're in, and just obey the rules and do what you have to do, and you start to realize, well, when the working class man is just walking around getting shit on, and you're getting nickel and dimed by the mayor, basically, you're just getting nickel and dimed, and nobody's saying anything, and it's happening all over, and it's right there in the open, and nobody could get on the same frequency because we're all taught that we're in the grasp of the system. Now's the time to stand up. I've been there since the 17th, and I live in New York, and I'll be there until the last day. And I hope there's not a last day. I hope the rest of the world wakes up. I hope that we all get on the same frequency and realize that if we just respect one another as neighbors, I mean, we can change the system. You know.
Hi, my name is Justin. I'm probably not going to stand up. So I've been there off and on since day one. I went to, he showed you the picture from Madrid. I was there on the 15th. I was in Athens. Tomorrow I go to Boston, blah, 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 blah. So base point being, I've been there basically since day one, off and on. As to why I came down, it's kind of a complex answer. Basically, I thought the war on terror was over, and then I realized that we're funding a terrorist group that's on our foreign terrorist organization list. We're funding and supporting them because they want to overthrow the Iranian government. And when you look into it, it's exactly the same thing that we did with Al-Qaeda. And I said, you know, we've been working on this stuff. We've been doing all of this, but I thought it was almost done, and we've learned nothing from it. That all said, there's just so many different problems that it's way more than I can probably encompass in like a minute and a half and 2 minutes. But yeah, so I've been here more or less since day one, off and on, helping people. I've put a lot of money into it. I've put a lot of my waking hours into it, and here I am now. So yeah.
So with that, I mean, I've got a whole bunch of questions, but I would actually prefer to take questions from the audience and just see what you guys want to know in regards to the occupation. Any hands?
Yeah, I guess I first heard the word occupy right after the bridge incident, and somebody explained to me. I guess the short answer is, how would you respond to the accusations that you're sort of a left-wing version of the Tea Party? Because a lot of the, quantifiers are the same. Grassroots movement, Wall Street, Main Street, disconnect, supposed to be non-partisan, even though it kind of is. So how would you guys respond to that?
So the question is basically how we respond to the question of we're basically a left-wing movement of the Tea Party.
Yeah, version of the Tea Party.
No.
Left.
that's true and it's not. I mean, we're just every bit as diverse as the country is. You have the Tea Party out there. You have the disillusioned, the people who have realized that the Tea Party is not the people that they thought they were. You have anarchists, you have socialists, you have just about everybody. So in the same sense that at least the base of the Tea Party is America, you have people that are upset about their government in some form or fashion. So it's true to some degree and then not. I mean, we're not as controlled in one particular fashion. We're not. I mean, let's call spades spades. The Tea Party are neocons. They are the neocons rebranded. I prefer to call them the teocons. And like that's we're not as they're far more organized and far more oriented in one direction than we are. You have Ron Paul's supporters out there. You have socialists. You have anarchists. You have communists. You have everybody out there. So yes, that's kind of true. But then there's also that's kind of only looking at one small subsection of the group.
Joe, what did you want to say?
There's one difference. The Tea Party's corporately funded, we're not. It's about as simple as that.
Yeah, I'd like to speak to this on a cultural thing. I'm a Southerner. In the town we live in, Ripley, Tennessee, most of the white people in that town are Tea Partiers. And there's a huge, huge difference between the Tea Party and us. As you just mentioned, we're a very homogenous group of people. We have political opinions from everywhere. We have people of all ethnicities, I mean, this is one of the most diverse groups that I've ever seen come together in anything, around anything, even more so than sports, and which tends to be a very unifying thing. Another thing, we're not armed. The Tea Party is armed to the teeth. We're not violent. That's a major, major thing right there. And like I said, they're just a very homogenous group, and they have been co-opted by one political party. Maybe they've co-opted the political party themselves, because it looks to me like the tail's wagging the dog over there. But the other day we're not going to become co-opted by either one of the political parties. The other day I was working behind the information desk, and a staff member, Dennis Kucinich, came up, and he called me over. I was standing there. I had a coat and tie on. Nobody else did, so I guess that's why he called me over. He calls me over and says, "Congressman Kucinich has written y'all a letter of support." And I looked at it and I handed it to somebody from media. They looked at it and threw it in the trash. They said, "I like Kucinich, but we're not going to let any politicians co-opt us." So they can support us, they can say, but we're not going to put their message out for them. We're not going to associate ourselves with them. Yeah, they're welcome to say they love us, whatever they want to do, but we're not going to work for them. We're not going to put their press releases out for them. We're going to have nothing to do with the Democratic Party, because I feel like the Democratic Party is not that much different from the Republican Party as far as what's happening economically.
We're going to move to the next question, if that's all right.
This is a question for anybody who wants to answer on the panel. How do you guys connect the dots between what's been unfolding in the Arab world, what's currently unfolding in Europe, and what's happening now? Are there any connections to be made between these dots? Or
Absolutely. I mean, what started in Tunisia last year when Mohamed Bouazizi lit himself on fire because he couldn't open up a fruit stand. There was a lot of pent-up rage in North Africa and like the rest of the world because of commodities prices. It was hard for people to eat, people to get anywhere. It's the same thing here. We might be playing with more money, but they're taking more money away from us. So, like that set off a chain reaction that went from Tunisia to Egypt, spread to Libya, throughout the Middle East. And finally, he came back here. Like I've heard for like the past couple months, like, well, why aren't we doing that here? And now here we are. The corruption came straight back to Wall Street. It's not a coincidence that this happened, because if you look at what a lot of these banks are doing, I want to single out one, Goldman Sachs. They've got schemes all over the world to speculate on commodities. and other, like, just take as much money from everybody as possible. The whole world is connected, and we are one big, giant living organism, and what's happening on Wall Street is that they are sucking away from all of us. So, and to answer your question, it's absolutely, everything's all connected. I think so, at least.
Pete, let's take one more, okay?
Yeah, can we do one more question?
Hi, I totally support what you guys are doing, and I've participated in some events. But when you showed that slide before with statistics about what the occupiers sort of think, and 30% was about sort of corporate greed and whatnot, and then 6% or less, I think two out of the three of those issues were about income inequality and redistribution of wealth, which to me are the fundamental issues that sort of bring people together across the world. Sometimes it's corporations doing it, sometimes it's governments, whatever. I feel like that's where maybe Americans or this movement could be really helpful in sort of, getting people banded together around fixing those issues, because that's an age-old issue. The corporate thing I see as sort of post-World War II. I'm just wondering, do you think that you guys are being effective in changing people's perceptions and behaviors and getting them to really rise up against things like income inequality and these things that only less than 6% of the population you surveyed thinks is important?
So I look at this as kind of like 1960, 1961, something like that, and it's hard to tell what will come out of this. The problem with terms like class warfare and income or wealth redistribution is that we've been really, really programmed against socialism, and those are kind of loaded terms. And nothing you can say or do against a good cross-section of the population will ever convince them that that's anything but evil. So I personally avoid those terms specifically because I'm never going to win any specific front. That said, like, will it come out? Like, I'm pretty sure we're going to be the backdrop of the next presidential election. I'm pretty sure that we have the beginnings of a shantytown in downtown Manhattan. I'm pretty sure that this is happening, like, as Americans, we're very American-centric, but like, this is happening all over the world, from South Africa and Korea to Australia. Like, Occupy Melbourne was, like, we kind of missed it all, but that was completely, the Queen's in town, that was completely beaten down in the streets. Manchester, the first day, they had 35,000 people. It's all over the world.
I hate to cut you off, but we should probably jump to the next, just for time's sake. Oh, that's it?
Yeah, let's wrap it up.
All right, well...
Gentlemen, it was fantastic. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
It's unfortunately we are out of time. There's another show coming in which I encourage you all to stick around for. But I'd like to thank the panel for coming here and sharing their time. I know a lot of you have many more questions, and here's your opportunity to talk to them. So please make use of it. And please stick around, and I'd like to thank Drum again for being such a great host, and Pete for going so far and beyond to make this happen, to David, and to all of you. Thank you.
Definitely take the time to talk to these guys. They've got a lot to say.
And whoever it was that asked about the reverberation of the Middle East and Europe, please find me, because I was in Madrid on the 15th, and I've been in Athens, and I've been in a couple places that I can answer this question pretty well.
We've had activists from Egypt, from Tahrir Square, been in here doing teach-ins here at Zuccotti Park. They've come in from Egypt to do it. I can never live without you.
Oh, I hate to see the sun go down. I hate to see that even the sun go down. Don't complain, she don't let it down. Yeah, I'm feeling you, mama. I feel you, mama. Just like I go to pack my friends. Can't make my get away. St. Louis woman, it's your time already. You pull my gal around, by your hand from well, it was for that cloud and all that yeah, that gal I love, it was gone so far. I got to St. Louis blues just moved on time. Yeah, the gal got a heart like a rocket ship. falling down. Boys and girls together, tell me where we go. We've driven like fantastic on the sidewalk of New York. Thank you very much. Beautiful dog, great big beautiful dog. Let me put my arms around your heart. Could never live without you. Beautiful dog, great big beautiful dog. If you ever leave me, how my heart will ache. Wanna hug you, but I feel your breath well on. Oh, 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 you beautiful dog. I got to see the just all Won't you come home, Bill Bailey? with nothing but a mighty telephone. I know that I'm the way on the shame. Well, baby, won't you please come home? I know that I'm to blame on this shame. Just better won't you please come home, oh yeah. If baby won't you please come on home. It's so slanted that it touches the ground. Like a fall down shack, railroad track. I build a young man's mansion, or calling it back. But I'd give up the past if I were a king. All that about it's mine and everything. There's a queen waiting there with the silver crown and the shanty, the old shanty town. It's fine everything. There's a dream with a silver crown in a shanty, in old shanty town, old shanty town, in old shanty town. London bridges falling down.